Welcome to Conversational Pace. I am your host, Brett Hornig. This is my co-host,
Finn Melanson. And Brett, what shoe do we have today?
So today we have the Hoka Mafate Speed 4. And we actually recorded this shoe review back in October before the idea of this channel even existed. But one thing we did know was that we wanted to start reviewing some trail shoes.
And now these shoe reviews finally have a home.
That they do. And with all that being said, let's get to the Hoka Mafate Speed 4 trail shoe review.
I'm doing great. It is a beautiful early fall day in the Wasatch. In my opinion, it's the best time to be in the Salt Lake area running trails. It's that brief window where it's cool, air is crisp, and there's still not any snow up in the high country. So, and the leaves are changing. So it's the time when all the photographers are out probably getting their glory shots for all the magazines and marketing and whatnot.
Sounds like a great time to test a trail shoe.
I'd say so myself.
Cool. Well, on deck today, we have the Hoka Mafate Speed 4. These shoes were provided to us by Hoka, but we are under no financial obligation to say whether we like a product or not, because we want to keep these reviews authentic and beneficial for you. All these opinions are our own. So with that, we're going to get on to the fourth generation of the Mafate Speed series. The Mafate is actually one of Hoka's original shoe models, but the Speed series has definitely taken a turn and carved out its own pathway in Hoka's trail running lineup. Some quick stats about the shoe. The shoe comes in at $185 now, which we'll definitely talk about later on in this episode. The weight on my copy scale for my size 10 is 10.9 ounces, so not the lightest shoe in the world, but I also don't care too much about weight because so much of the weight of a shoe comes down to how it feels. Stack height, 29 millimeters in the forefoot, 33 in the heel, makes for a 4 millimeter drop. Definitely puts this in that higher stack, high cushion category. In terms of the materials, we've got a single layer jacquard mesh upper, a few plastic overlays, mostly around the lace eyelets and across the toe bumper. We have a thinner, stretchier mesh just above the forefoot, which I think is just mostly there for comfort and maybe allowing for a little bit of extra width if you need it to stretch. The midsole is a part of Hoka's ProFly lineup that is getting increasingly more confusing that I'm going to try and very quickly explain. So they're calling this a two-part ProFly outsole. And what ProFly is it's not a foam, it's a feeling. ProFly is a softer heel into a firmer forefoot, which makes for a slightly more dynamic and explosive ride. ProFly Plus, which is the part of the foam that's directly underfoot, is a little bit softer and bouncier than the section of foam that's closer to the ground. Ultimately, what that's led to is a little bit lighter weight than previous Mafates, as well as a little bit softer and bouncier feel. The outsole is still Vibram's Mega Grip outsole, which is, I think, my favorite outsole of all time, at least in terms of like rubber compound. This new Mega Grip outsole is attached to Vibram's Light Base, which is essentially just a thinner base layer of rubber. It allows for the shoe to be a little bit more flexible. It also saves a lot of weight. Finn, how much did you run in this shoe?
I got a whopping 115 miles out of this shoe. I wore much of it during my July and early August training block in the central Wasatch Mountains. So if you're familiar with the area, think Big Cottonwood Canyon, Little Cottonwood Canyon, somewhat rocky, loose single track, a lot of these old mining trails, lots of vert, lots of ascending and descending on grades ranging from 10% to 30%. I also had a chance to actually race in this shoe. So I raced the 2022 Speed Goat 50K, which it's a crazy course, but there's a lot of variety, a mix of single track, double track, even some non-trail. It's all at altitude, lots of vert, lots of scree, lots of instability, requires a lot of courage in some cases in terms of like the descents that are involved. So this was an excellent shoe to experience that, and we'll talk about it a lot more in this episode. But that was my experience. What about you?
I got in 98 miles in these shoes, so close to triple digits, but I know I'll end up throwing this shoe on a lot more. Mostly in Ashland. I actually did get a couple runs in over at Winter Park, Colorado. So I did at least get to touch a few rocks with the shoe. I did a lot of harder workouts as well as easy long runs in this shoe. So I actually trusted it to perform across a pretty wide variety of efforts. I still mostly took this on non-technical terrain, single track, dirt road, pretty much all dry conditions. But yeah, I definitely put the shoe to work for sure. Finn, how did you feel about the overall fit of the shoe throughout your testing?
Yeah, I think I have 4 or 5 key takeaways here. With the caveat that this is without a doubt my favorite Hoka shoe of all time, and I've tried almost all of them. I had a couple issues come up in the forefoot. Some significant bunching towards the bottom of the lacing pattern, especially as I would tighten up the shoe. There would be these gaps that are created on either side of the lacing. Just enough room for really annoying bits of debris and even like twigs and just pieces of rock to get through and disrupt the flow in the foot. And especially in the Wasatch, where again, I was at races like Speed Go and I was on these old mining trails where there's just a lot of debris underfoot. I did find that this shoe would collect some of that, especially on runs longer than like an hour where there was just more opportunity for those interactions to happen. But there was a lot of situations with the shoe where like looks are kind of deceiving. So for example, in the forefoot, when you take it out of the box, at first glance, it appears like it's going to be a very narrow foot. And as somebody with a wide foot, I questioned whether I was going to get it in there. It was going to be snug and comfortable. It's actually more of a medium fit in my experience. And it actually sometimes even fits large. There's plenty of room for my wide forefoot display, the big toe, the little toe, no chafing. Again, with the tongue, looks are kind of deceiving. I thought I was going to get like this bulky tongue that kind of inhibited breathability. But it fit soft. It wasn't overbearing on the top of the foot. That was enjoyable. I questioned sort of the higher heel cup here. It definitely rides up on the Achilles, and it didn't chafe, and the lock-in is great, which I think is one of the aims with these higher heel cups. One other concern, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but with the upper, we often ask the question, is the material in the upper going to last the duration of the shoe? And I'm already starting to see some blowouts near the pinky toe and the big toe, as well as in the upper lacing pattern. For me, at least, this is common in Hokas. I've gotten tons of miles, thousands of miles in the various versions of the Torrent and the Challenger, and those blowouts are common for me in those shoes. And I do see evidence of that forming in this shoe about 100 miles in. So I'm on the lookout for that. And then I'm sure you're going to get into this, but the outsole is like what makes this, in my opinion, like the greatest Hoka of all time. It's the trump card. They call them traction lugs, and then they have the Vibram Mega Grip. And again, I'm always on the lookout for marketing jargon, but it's the truth in this case. Like, I'm somebody that struggles with technical downhill and the courage to descend those parts of trail running confidently. And this shoe, this outsole gave me a lot of the courage I needed to have just really successful training runs in those environments. So those were my takeaways. What about you, Brett?
Yeah, so this shoe I've worn every single Mafate shoe. So like the Evo Mafate, the Evo Mafate 2, and then last year's Mafate Speed 3 before now this Mafate Speed 4. My favorite one was, I actually have one, the Evo Mafate 2, and I actually like nearly every element of this new Mafate Speed 4 better. So the lockdown around my arch and my heel is great. I love the swooping heel collar. It allows me to step into the shoe much easier. And then the Achilles bit of the ankle collar can be a little bit higher, but not dig into the Achilles, which I've always had kind of touchy Achilles tendon. So it's nice that it actually angles outward. In terms of the fit, going towards the forefoot, I had plenty of room. Like it's definitely a medium to higher volume shoe. Like when I put the shoe on, there is no material touching my toes at all. And at first that worried me a little bit in that it wouldn't be able to hold my foot down on running steeper terrain. But the combination of this pretty, non-stretch kind of tighter knit mesh, as well as a pretty stable, rigid heel cup, really does lock the foot down. So I was, after the first run, there was no break-in period for this shoe for me. After the very first run, I was like, yep, this is the shoe I'm going to run all my important workouts in. I had no problem taking it for any distance long run. I went, 5.5 hours with almost 7,000 feet of climbing last weekend in this shoe. No issues at all. Never had to retie it. Yeah, and also going back to, the outsole, it's a little bit different than the previous versions of Mafate. If anything, it's just better. I do like the increased flexibility that you get from the slightly softer foam, as well as the light base outsole. And, all of those elements have led to a really fun shoe, which kind of leads to, what did Hoka design this shoe for?
Yeah. So to me, the obvious use cases, and I think this is in line with what Hoka is billing it as. It's the shoe for these like performance-based technical verti mountain 50Ks, mountain trail marathons, 50 mileage up to 100K, I would say. And is that about in line, would you say, Brett?
I would have no problem taking this even longer than 100K.
Really?
Yeah, from a cushioning standpoint, I never felt like I was even coming close to bottoming it out. And after 100 miles, there's a little bit of creasing on the top part of the foam, but when I step in it, it still feels virtually brand new. Even the way the cushioning felt after running, continuous 5 hour run in it, like it felt just as good at a lot as mile one. So if I'm running something like UTMB next year, like this is one of the front runners for me for that sort of course. Interestingly, it would also be a front runner for a short technical course as well, because I feel like I have a huge amount of confidence running fast downhill in the shoe. So, I think Hoka might have made a bit of a boo-boo in that they designed a shoe that does a better job than some of its other shoes. And that might be good or bad for them. But, I'm sure a lot of the biggest comparison is like, how does this compare to the Speed Goat? How does this compare to the Tecton X? And as of right now, I've always been on Team Speed Goat for everything. And then the Tecton X came out, and I'm like, oh, I'm on Team Tecton. But now I'm on Team Mafate. Like, I wore the Tecton X for the first 50K of Western States this year, and then switched out of it. I might actually have just done the entire race in this shoe, which is not what Hoka designed it for. But it's such a smooth shoe to run in, and it's so comfortable that I might almost wear this for nearly every race scenario in the trails.
Yeah, and if you're somebody like me who has a wider forefoot, and even with the wider version of the Speed Goat, you've just struggled to fit that shoe and perform with it. Like you said, I think that this is a great alternative. It's definitely a great alternative to the Tecton. But even for folks out there that, for whatever reason, you're in that small minority that never got to enjoy the spoils of the Speed Goat, this is your saving grace. It's immediately added to my arsenal. I couldn't agree with you more about all the praises you're singing. And I'll just reinforce that as somebody who has always sort of lacked the courage or the confidence for one reason or another to really like rip technical descents, just feel confident to just like fully descend and not stop and start or check myself. This is the shoe. I guess I'll have to rethink like races like UTMB and just use cases where it's like more than like 12 to 14 hours time on feet. But like if I'm getting ready for a race like the Canyons 100K in the spring, or any of these more like Verdi Mountain 100Ks, I'm immediately thinking about this shoe. And it's funny, like, despite the fact that, if you look at the specs, it's a relatively heavy shoe, I feel fast and agile in it, which to me, I can just chalk up to like Hoka has done a masterful job using the right materials. And sure, it's heavy, but they've just distributed it gracefully and meaningfully, and it works. So
yeah, totally.
I think it lives up.
I do have one gripe with this shoe, and that's been the case with every single Mafate, and that's been one of the deciding factors between Team Speedgoat, Team Mafate, is the Mafate doesn't have very much of a rocker. The Speedgoat's rocker starts a lot earlier and is a lot longer. Due to this Mafate not being that rocker of a shoe, I have clipped my foot with this lug here about in the middle on rocks and stuff, and almost eaten it so many times. I'm getting better because I'm learning, but I have almost biffed it on the shoe due to the slight flatter nature of the shoe. The big pro, though, of having slightly less rocker is the shoe becomes more stable when your foot hits the ground, which is also why it's so fun to descend in. So you got to make sure to pick up those toes a little bit, but you do get a much more secure descending shoe. So in terms of the value, this is a pretty expensive shoe. It's $185. Does that price match how you feel about the shoe?
Yeah, I think we'll probably end up saying the same thing here. But whenever I look at the price tag of a shoe, one thing that I immediately think of correspondingly is like, how much reliable mileage am I going to get out of this thing? Like, is it going to break down after 200 or 250 miles like a lot of these road oriented super shoes will do? Or like, am I going to get like 400, 500, 600 solid training miles out of this thing? And where my mind is at is like, on a dollar cost per mile average, I'm going to get a ton of value. Like that $185 is going to be reliably spread out over like 500, 600 miles, which makes the purchase worth it if you think about it in that context. Like I've already put 115 miles into this shoe. As I mentioned, I'm a little bit worried about how long the upper is going to last, but with the outsole, etc., I think that I'm going to be training with this shoe like well into January, and then I'm going to get like probably 500 or 600 miles on it. So those are my thoughts.
So you figure that's about how many miles you get before the upper gets totally blown out. Do you think that's the first part of the shoe
upper might go as early as like 300 miles? So that is my big concern. But like if the upper stays intact, we're just talking about the rest of the shoe, I think I can train with this for 600 miles.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And there are definitely shoes out there that I will get as many miles as this Mafate Speed 4 that cost less. But where I got a lot of value out of the shoe is it's really fun. Like I like shoes, to me, are kind of like pieces of art, and I want to be able to put the shoe on and feel something when I go for a run. And this is one of those shoes that does make me excited to go out and like hammer a workout or do a long run, because I get to put this shoe on and I get to get out the door and go use it. And I anticipate I would get, probably 400, 500 quality miles out of it. But even if that number was 300, I've enjoyed running in this shoe so much that I'm getting a lot of additional value just by how fun it's been to run in. And that's a very important part of the value of a shoe for me, is how much I actually enjoy it and how much I want to put it on and go running in it.
Well, in terms of calls to action, I have a few questions that I'd love to throw out to listeners and viewers out there. The first one is, if you're a Hoka fan, where does this shoe fit in your arsenal? And like, as you mentioned earlier, Brett, what are the pros and cons of picking it over, say, the Speedgoat 5 or the Tecton X? And so if you have any thoughts there, comment below. But also, I'm curious, when you think about the counterparts in Salomon or Ultra or Adidas, what is the Mafate equivalent in those brands? Or does it even exist? And I'd be curious to know how you think Hoka's Mafate compares to any other equivalents or competitors out there. So Those are my two. But do you have anything else, Brett?
Yeah, I would actually be really curious, like what outside of Hoka are you comparing this shoe to, or do you think this shoe competes well against? Yeah, I've had a blast with this shoe, and maybe we'll do a, top shoes episode later on in the year to see what our favorites are. But as of right now, this shoe is at a very minimum, it's on the podium. I don't want to say what else we've been running in and trying out, but this one's up there for me.